In a bustling city, a grandmother's world is transformed when her beloved grandson disappears without a trace. As the days pass, dark secrets emerge, challenging everything she thought she knew. Witness the extraordinary journey of an ordinary woman as she uncovers a web of deceit, brings together an entire community, and confronts an unthinkable truth. In just a few minutes, you'll gain a powerful tool to protect your loved ones from the darkest of circumstances. A story that will forever change the way you see your neighbors. Welcome, enjoy, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Mrs. Liu stood at her kitchen window, the familiar scent of jasmine tea wafting through her cozy apartment. Her eyes crinkled with a smile as she watched the bustling street below, a tapestry of urban life unfolding before her. The sound of keys jingling at the door announced her grandson Alex's return from school. At 72, Mrs. Liu found immense joy in these simple moments of connection with her family. As Alex burst through the door, his backpack swinging wildly, she marveled at how quickly he was growing up. Their bond, forged through years of after-school snacks and homework sessions, was a constant source of comfort in her life. "Nai Nai," Alex called out, using the affectionate Chinese term for grandmother. "I got an A on my science project." His enthusiasm was contagious, and Mrs. Liu felt a surge of pride. She listened intently as he recounted every detail of his presentation, her weathered hands busy preparing a plate of sliced apples and almond cookies. The apartment, though modest, was filled with the warmth of their shared laughter and the aroma of home-cooked meals. It was a sanctuary amidst the chaos of the city, a place where love and tradition intertwined seamlessly. As the afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains, Mrs. Liu settled into her favorite armchair, Alex perched on the ottoman at her feet. She began to tell him stories of her childhood in China, tales of resilience and hope that had carried her through life's challenges. Alex listened with rapt attention, his eyes wide with wonder. In these moments, Mrs. Liu felt the weight of her years lift, replaced by the lightness of shared memories and the promise of new ones to come. The bond between them was palpable, a thread of love that stretched across generations. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, but within the walls of their home, time seemed to slow. Mrs. Liu watched as Alex tackled his homework, offering gentle guidance when needed. She marveled at his quick mind and kind heart, seeing in him the best of their family's values. As the day wound down, they worked together to prepare dinner, Alex eagerly learning the secrets of his grandmother's famous dumplings. The kitchen filled with the sounds of chopping and sizzling, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the occasional Mandarin phrase as Mrs. Liu taught Alex the names of ingredients. As night fell, Mrs. Liu tucked Alex into bed, smoothing his hair with a tender touch. She whispered a traditional blessing, her voice soft but filled with the strength of her love. Returning to the living room, she paused to look at the family photos adorning the walls, each one a testament to the bonds that held them together. Mrs. Liu felt a deep sense of contentment wash over her. Little did she know that this peaceful evening was the quiet before a storm that would test the very foundations of their family's love and loyalty. The next day began like any other, with Mrs. Liu waving goodbye to Alex as he headed off to school. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and the air was filled with the promise of spring. As she watched her grandson disappear around the corner, Mrs. Liu felt a fleeting sense of unease, quickly dismissed as she returned to her daily routine. The hours ticked by, marked by the familiar rhythms of housework and preparation for Alex's return. But as the afternoon wore on, an unusual silence settled over the apartment. The clock on the wall seemed to mock her growing anxiety, its ticking growing louder with each passing minute. When the phone finally rang, Mrs. Liu's heart leapt into her throat. It was Alex's school, their tone grave as they informed her that her grandson had never arrived that morning. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as the reality of the situation sank in. Alex, her beloved Alex, was missing. Mrs. Liu's hands shook as she dialed her son and daughter-in-law, her voice barely above a whisper as she relayed the news. Within minutes, the apartment was filled with the frantic energy of family members arriving, their faces etched with worry and fear. The police were called, and soon the small living room was crowded with officers asking questions and taking notes. Mrs. Liu watched in a daze as her son paced back and forth, his voice rising in frustration with each unanswered call to Alex's phone. Her daughter-in-law sat silently on the couch, tears streaming down her face as she clutched one of Alex's school photos. The weight of their shared anguish hung heavy in the air, suffocating in its intensity. Mrs. Liu found herself retreating to the kitchen, seeking solace in the familiar act of making tea, her hands moving on autopilot as her mind raced with possibilities. As night fell, the initial shock gave way to a grim determination. Flyers with Alex's photo were hastily printed, and plans were made to search the neighborhood. Mrs. Liu insisted on joining the search parties, despite her son's protests about her age and health. Her voice, usually so soft, took on a steely edge as she declared, "He is my grandson. I will look for him until he is found." The family's fear was palpable, but so was their resolve. They would leave no stone unturned in their quest to bring Alex home. In the quiet moments between the flurry of activity, Mrs. Liu found herself drawn to Alex's room. She sat on the edge of his bed, running her hand over his favorite blanket, still rumpled from the morning rush. Memories flooded her mind. Alex's first steps, his proud smile on his first day of school, the sound of his laughter echoing through the apartment. As tears began to fall, Mrs. Liu felt a fierce determination take root in her heart. She would find Alex, no matter what it took. With a deep breath, she stood, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead in the search for her beloved grandson. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, mirroring the somber mood that had settled over the Liu family. Mrs. Liu, having barely slept, was already dressed and ready to begin the search anew. She moved through the apartment with quiet efficiency, preparing a thermos of tea and a bag of snacks for the long day ahead. As she worked, she overheard her son on the phone with the police, his voice strained as he pressed for updates. The lack of new information was a heavy burden, but Mrs. Liu refused to let despair take hold. She knew that every minute counted, and she was determined to make each one matter. Stepping out onto the bustling street, Mrs. Liu was struck by how normal everything seemed. People hurried past, caught up in their own lives, unaware of the turmoil that had upended her world. With a stack of flyers clutched tightly in her hands, she approached her neighbors one by one. Some were sympathetic, promising to keep an eye out for Alex. Others brushed her off, too busy or disinterested to engage. Each interaction, whether positive or negative, tested Mrs. Liu's resolve. Yet she pressed on, driven by an unwavering love for her grandson and a deep-seated belief that someone, somewhere, must have seen something. As the day wore on, Mrs. Liu found herself venturing further from her familiar neighborhood streets. Her feet ached, and her voice grew hoarse from calling Alex's name, but she refused to give up. She searched playgrounds and parks, peered into alleyways, and questioned shopkeepers. Each dead end and false lead chipped away at her hope, but she clung fiercely to the memory of Alex's smile, using it as a talisman against despair. The physical toll of the search was evident in her slowed pace and the trembling of her hands, but her spirit remained unbroken. Late in the afternoon, Mrs. Liu received a call from her daughter-in-law. A neighbor had reported seeing a boy matching Alex's description near the old community center. Hope surged through her veins as she rushed to the location, her heart pounding with anticipation. But upon arrival, she found only a group of concerned neighbors and no sign of Alex. The disappointment was crushing, and for the first time since the search began, Mrs. Liu felt the full weight of her exhaustion and fear. She leaned against a wall, closing her eyes against the sting of tears, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city streets, Mrs. Liu made her way back home. The day's search had yielded no concrete results, but she refused to call it a failure. Each person she had spoken to, each flyer she had distributed, was a small step towards finding Alex. Entering the apartment, she was greeted by the sight of her family gathered around the dining table, their faces etched with worry and fatigue. Mrs. Liu straightened her shoulders, drawing on an inner strength she didn't know she possessed. "We will find him," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Tomorrow, we try again." With those words, she infused the room with a renewed sense of purpose, reminding them all that hope, like love, was a choice they would make every day until Alex was home. As the search for Alex entered its third day, Mrs. Liu found herself standing in the community center, surrounded by a growing group of volunteers. The room buzzed with activity as neighbors, many of whom she had only ever exchanged polite nods with before, came together with a shared purpose. Mrs. Liu watched in awe as people from all walks of life, the stern-faced businessman from the high-rise, the chatty barista from the corner cafe, even the reclusive artist from the top floor, gathered to offer their help. In this moment of crisis, the invisible barriers that often divided city dwellers seemed to melt away, replaced by a palpable sense of unity. Mr. Chen, the retired teacher from across the hall, approached Mrs. Liu with a gentle smile. "We've organized search parties to cover different areas of the neighborhood," he explained, his voice kind but determined. "And Mrs. Rodriguez from the bakery is coordinating with local businesses to put up flyers." Mrs. Liu felt a lump form in her throat, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. She had always believed in the power of community, but seeing it in action, especially in her darkest hour, was deeply moving. As she listened to Mr. Chen outline the search plans, she felt a flicker of hope reignite in her heart. The day unfolded in a flurry of activity, with Mrs. Liu at the center of it all. Despite her age, she insisted on joining one of the search parties, her determination inspiring those around her. As they combed through parks and alleyways, she found strength in the collective effort. Young mothers with strollers kept a watchful eye out for Alex, while a group of teenagers used their social media savvy to spread the word online. Even those who couldn't join the physical search found ways to contribute, cooking meals for the volunteers, offering up their vehicles for transportation, or simply providing words of encouragement. As evening approached, Mrs. Liu found herself sitting on a park bench, taking a moment to rest her weary feet. A young woman she recognized as the new tenant from the building next door sat down beside her, offering a bottle of water. "We haven't met properly," the woman said softly. "I'm Sarah. I can't imagine what you're going through, but I want you to know we're all here for you." Mrs. Liu felt tears well up in her eyes as she accepted the water with trembling hands. In this simple act of kindness, she found a profound comfort, a reminder that even in the vastness of the city, she was not alone. As the search party regrouped at the community center, Mrs. Liu looked around at the faces of her neighbors, now familiar and dear. Though Alex remained unfound, something beautiful had emerged from this tragedy, a reawakening of the bonds that tied their community together. Mr. Chen stood up to address the group, his voice filled with emotion. "We may not have found Alex today, but we found something else, each other, and together, we'll bring him home." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Mrs. Liu felt a surge of gratitude. In this moment, she realized that the strength to continue her search came not just from within, but from the collective heart of her community. The breakthrough came on the fourth day of the search, as Mrs. Liu was retracing her steps through Alex's usual route to school. She paused at the corner where she always watched him turn, her eyes scanning the familiar landscape. Suddenly a glint of metal caught her attention. There, half hidden beneath a bush, was Alex's distinctive keychain, a miniature globe he had received for his last birthday. Her heart racing, Mrs. Liu carefully retrieved the item, her hands shaking with a mixture of hope and fear. This was the first tangible clue they had found, and it sent a jolt of renewed energy through her tired body. Within minutes, the quiet street was a hive of activity. Police officers cordoned off the area, combing through every inch of the surrounding space. Mrs. Liu stood to the side, clutching the keychain to her chest as she watched the proceedings with bated breath. Her son arrived, his face a mask of tension as he spoke with the lead detective. As the search intensified, neighbors began to gather, offering what information they could. Mrs. Zhang, who lived in the house on the corner, stepped forward hesitantly. "I remember seeing a van parked here that morning," she said, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It was unusual because it blocked my view of the street." As the police pursued this new lead, Mrs. Liu found herself grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. The discovery of the keychain was both a blessing and a curse, proof that they were on the right track, but also a stark reminder of the danger Alex might be in. She closed her eyes, drawing deep breaths to calm her racing heart. When she opened them again, she was surprised to find Sarah, the young neighbor she had met in the park, standing beside her. Without a word, Sarah took Mrs. Liu's free hand in hers, offering silent support. In that moment, Mrs. Liu felt a surge of strength, bolstered by the unwavering support of her community. As the day wore on, more details emerged. A traffic camera had captured footage of a van matching Mrs. Zhang's description, and the police were working to trace its movements. Mrs. Liu listened intently as the detective explained their progress, her mind racing with possibilities. Could this be the break they had been waiting for? The tension in the air was palpable as everyone waited for more news. Throughout it all, Mrs. Liu remained a pillar of quiet strength, her faith in finding Alex unshaken despite the roller coaster of emotions she was experiencing. As night fell, the initial excitement of the discovery gave way to a renewed sense of urgency. Mrs. Liu returned home, the keychain safely tucked in her pocket, a tangible connection to her missing grandson. She sat at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched tea growing cold before her, as she replayed the day's events in her mind. The clue they had uncovered brought with it a mix of hope and fear. Hope that they were closer to finding Alex, and fear of what they might discover. As she prepared for another restless night, Mrs. Liu held onto the keychain, drawing comfort from its familiar shape. "We're coming, Alex," she whispered into the quiet apartment. "Hold on just a little longer." The following morning brought a startling development that would change the course of the search. Mrs. Liu was preparing to join the day's search party when her phone rang. It was Alex's school principal, her voice tense with urgency. "Mrs. Liu, we've just received some information that you need to hear," she said. "One of our teachers, Mr. Harris, didn't show up for work today. We've learned that he's been inappropriate with some students." Mrs. Liu felt her blood run cold as the principal continued, explaining that Mr. Harris had shown a particular interest in Alex. The pieces began to fall into place with sickening clarity. The van, the missing teacher, Alex's disappearance. It was no longer a simple case of a lost child, but something far more sinister. The revelation sent shockwaves through the family and the community. Police swarmed Mr. Harris's apartment, but found it empty, signs of a hasty departure evident. Mrs. Liu sat in stunned silence as detectives questioned her about any interactions Alex might have had with the teacher. She racked her brain, trying to recall any mention Alex had made, any signs she might have missed. The weight of guilt pressed down on her. How could she not have seen this coming? Her son paced the room, his face a mask of fury and fear, while her daughter-in-law wept quietly in the corner. The atmosphere in the apartment was thick with a mixture of shock, anger, and renewed determination. As the initial shock began to wear off, Mrs. Liu felt a fierce resolve take root in her heart. She had always taught Alex to be kind, to see the good in others. Had that very kindness made him vulnerable? The thought was almost unbearable. But dwelling on what-ifs would not bring Alex home. With a deep breath, she stood up, her voice steady as she addressed the room. "We know more now than we did yesterday," she said. "And tomorrow, we'll know even more. We will not rest until Alex is safe." Her words seemed to break the spell of despair that had settled over the family, replacing it with a renewed sense of purpose. The community's response to the new information was immediate and powerful. What had started as a search for a missing child now took on the urgency of a rescue mission. Volunteers redoubled their efforts, combing through areas they had already searched with fresh eyes. Social media buzzed with updates and calls for information about Mr. Harris's whereabouts. Mrs. Liu found herself at the heart of this whirlwind of activity, her quiet strength a beacon for those around her. Despite the fear that gnawed at her heart, she refused to let it paralyze her. Every lead, no matter how small, was pursued with vigor. As night fell, Mrs. Liu stood at her kitchen window, looking out at the city lights. The revelation about Mr. Harris had shaken her faith in the world, but not her faith in her grandson or her community. She thought of Alex, his bright smile, his curious mind, his gentle heart, and silently vowed to bring him home, no matter the cost. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but Mrs. Liu knew she wouldn't walk it alone. With the support of her family, her neighbors, and an entire city now on high alert, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring new leads, new hopes, and perhaps the key to bringing Alex back to the safety of her arms. The breakthrough came on the 7th day of Alex's disappearance. A tip from a gas station attendant on the outskirts of the city led police to an abandoned warehouse. Mrs. Liu insisted on accompanying the search team, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. As they approached the dilapidated building, the air was thick with tension. Police officers moved swiftly, their voices low and urgent. Mrs. Liu watched from a safe distance, her hands clasped tightly together, every fiber of her being focused on the possibility of reuniting with Alex. The minutes stretched like hours as Mrs. Liu waited for news. Suddenly, a commotion erupted from within the warehouse. Shouts echoed across the empty lot, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Mrs. Liu's breath caught in her throat as she saw a figure burst out of a side door. It was Mr. Harris, his face contorted with panic. Without thinking, Mrs. Liu stepped forward, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "Stop!" she commanded, surprising even herself with the authority in her tone. Mr. Harris froze, his eyes wild as he looked at the elderly woman standing between him and freedom. In that moment, as Mrs. Liu faced the man who had taken her grandson, she felt a surge of emotions, anger, fear, and an overwhelming need to protect Alex. She spoke again, her voice unwavering. "Where is my grandson?" she demanded. Mr. Harris seemed to deflate under the weight of her gaze, the fight leaving him as police officers closed in. As he was handcuffed and led away, Mrs. Liu heard the most beautiful sound in the world, Alex's voice calling out for her. She turned to see him emerging from the warehouse, escorted by a police officer, looking tired and frightened, but blessedly unharmed. The reunion was a blur of tears and tight embraces. Mrs. Liu held Alex close, her body shaking with relief as she whispered words of comfort in a mixture of English and Mandarin. Alex clung to her, his small frame racked with sobs as the fear and tension of the past week finally released. Around them, police officers and search volunteers watched with misty eyes, the emotion of the moment palpable. Mrs. Liu's son and daughter-in-law arrived, enveloping Alex in their arms, the family finally whole again. As the initial shock of the reunion subsided, Mrs. Liu found herself overwhelmed with gratitude for the tireless efforts of the police, the unwavering support of her community, and the strength she had found within herself. She looked at Alex, memorizing every detail of his face, vowing never to take a single moment with him for granted again. As they prepared to leave the scene, Mrs. Liu turned to thank the officers and volunteers. In their faces, she saw reflected the same joy and relief she felt, a powerful reminder of the bonds that had been forged in the crucible of this ordeal. The days following Alex's rescue were a whirlwind of medical checkups, police interviews, and emotional reunions. Mrs. Liu rarely left Alex's side, providing a constant source of comfort and security as he began to process his ordeal. The family's apartment became a sanctuary, filled with the warmth of loved ones and the aroma of Mrs. Liu's healing soups and teas. As Alex slowly began to open up about his experience, Mrs. Liu listened with a heart full of love and sorrow, marveling at her grandson's resilience even as she ached for the innocence he had lost. The community that had come together during the search continued to rally around the Liu family. Neighbors dropped by with home-cooked meals and words of support. Alex's classmates sent cards and drawings, their childish scrawls full of joy at his return. Even strangers who had followed the case reached out with messages of encouragement. This outpouring of love and support created a cocoon of safety around the family, allowing them the space to begin healing. Mrs. Liu found herself deeply moved by the kindness of others, each gesture a reminder of the inherent goodness in people. As the initial shock of the events began to fade, Mrs. Liu noticed subtle changes in herself and her family. They held each other closer, laughed a little louder, and treasured the small moments of everyday life with newfound appreciation. Family dinners became a nightly ritual, with Alex eagerly helping his grandmother in the kitchen, their bond stronger than ever. Mrs. Liu watched with pride as her grandson slowly regained his confidence, each smile and laugh a victory over the darkness they had faced. She marveled at the resilience of the human spirit, especially in one so young. The experience had also forged new connections within their community. Mrs. Liu found herself forming friendships with neighbors she had barely known before, united by their shared experience of the search. She began organizing weekly gatherings at the community center, bringing together those who had been involved in Alex's rescue. These meetings became a source of healing for many, a place to share stories, offer support, and strengthen the bonds that had been formed. Mrs. Liu realized that out of this painful ordeal, a stronger, more connected community had emerged. As weeks turned into months, Mrs. Liu reflected on the lessons learned from their harrowing experience. She saw how love, both within the family and from the wider community, had been the driving force behind Alex's rescue. She recognized the strength she had discovered within herself, a resilience she hoped to pass on to her grandson. Most importantly, she understood the power of unity and compassion in the face of adversity. These realizations became the foundation for a new chapter in their lives, one built on gratitude, awareness, and an unshakable belief in the goodness of people. 6 months after Alex's return, life had settled into a new normal for the Liu family. The apartment buzzed with the familiar sounds of everyday life. Alex's laughter, the clatter of pots and pans as Mrs. Liu prepared dinner, the murmur of conversation as family gathered in the evening. Yet beneath the surface of this normalcy, there was a profound change. Each moment was infused with a deeper appreciation, a conscious gratitude for the simple joy of being together. Mrs. Liu watched her grandson with a mixture of love and wonder, marveling at his ability to find happiness and excitement in the world again. The experience had left its mark on all of them, but none more so than Mrs. Liu herself. She found herself taking on a more active role in the community, driven by a desire to strengthen the connections that had proved so vital during their time of need. She began volunteering at the local school, sharing her wisdom and life experiences with a new generation. Her gentle presence and quiet strength made her a beloved figure among students and teachers alike. Through these efforts, she hoped to create a safer, more connected world for Alex and all children. As autumn leaves began to fall, bringing with them the promise of change, a new challenge emerged. Alex's school announced plans to close due to budget cuts, threatening to disrupt the stability he had worked so hard to regain. Mrs. Liu felt a familiar determination rise within her. She knew that this time, she wouldn't be facing the challenge alone. With the same spirit that had driven the search for Alex, she began to rally the community. Meetings were held, petitions were signed, and creative fundraising efforts were launched. Mrs. Liu found herself at the heart of this movement, her quiet resolve inspiring others to action. The campaign to save the school became a unifying force for the neighborhood. People from all walks of life came together, contributing what they could: time, skills, resources. Mrs. Liu watched with pride as Alex took an active role, speaking at community meetings about the importance of his school with a poise that belied his young age. She saw in him the seeds of the leader he might one day become, his difficult experience having instilled in him a deep understanding of the power of community and perseverance. As the year drew to a close, Mrs. Liu stood at her kitchen window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. The outcome of their efforts to save the school was still uncertain, but she felt a sense of peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew they would face them together, as a family and as a community. She thought of Alex, sleeping soundly in the next room, and smiled. The journey had been difficult, but it had led them to this moment of quiet strength and unwavering hope. As she turned away from the window, Mrs. Liu felt ready for whatever the future might bring, secure in the knowledge that love, resilience, and the bonds of community would light their way forward. I really hope you enjoyed the story. Please leave a comment with your views. I'm sure there will be new videos on this channel that will thrill you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos. Until next time.